All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be. My name is Asha Shelzo, and I serve as the director of the Health Law and Policy Program at American University, Washington College of Law. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this important session, and we are going to be discussing LGBTQ plus health equity and access to gender-affirming care. This is part of our Future of Healthcare series, which we launched last year, and we're very pleased to be in our second year and to have some terrific partners, the American Health Law Association and the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. The AHLA is the nation's largest nonpartisan 501c3 educational organization devoted to legal issues in the healthcare field. The association maintains excellence in health law by educating and connecting the health law community. ASLME is a nonprofit educational organization whose mission is to provide high-quality scholarship, debate, and critical thought for professionals at the intersection of law, medicine, and ethics. A thank you to AHLA and ASLME for partnering with us in these really important programs. We really appreciate your connection and the education that you're helping us bring to the community. So the Future of Healthcare series is something that we brought together to examine trends, challenges, and opportunities in healthcare on a wide range of timely and relevant health law topics. So a couple of administrative matters before I turn things over to our moderator and faculty director, Professor of Law, Maya Mannion. The live captioning is available for this event, and please feel free to access that through the captioning button. The event is being recorded, and you will find it on our Future of Healthcare website next week. And you can also find recordings from our past events there, as well as some information about upcoming Future of Healthcare programs. We do have a Q&A box. Please do go ahead and put your questions throughout the program into the Q&A box, and we'll try our best to get to them as soon as we can. And finally, there are going to be some links in the chat, and this will be helpful for you to get some references of our speakers and some other resources. So again, thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to our terrific panelists, Trent, Heather, and Kellan. We'll hear a lot more about them as they're introduced in a moment. I'm going to turn things over to Maya, who I mentioned is our faculty director and professor of law. She's also a nationally recognized expert on reproductive rights and justice. Her scholarship investigates the relationship between constitutional law, family law, and healthcare law. With that, Maya, I'll turn over to you. Please share more about yourself, as well as introduce our wonderful panelists. Again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Asha, and hello, everyone. If you are just joining, my name is Maya Mannion. I'm the faculty director of the Health Law and Policy Program and professor of law at American University, Washington College of Law. It's wonderful to have you all joining us for our first event this year, LGBTQ plus health equity and access to gender-affirming care. Our distinguished panelists are Kellan Baker, Trent Stechschulte, and Heather Walter-McCabe. I will briefly introduce each of them, and then we will get started in our conversation. Dr. Kellan Baker is the executive director of Whitman-Walker Institute, research policy and education arm of Whitman-Walker, which is a community health system in Washington, D.C. that is affiliated with a federally qualified health center. Dr. Baker is a frequent advisor on health equity research and policy, with a particular focus on LGBTQ plus populations, and he holds appointments as affiliate faculty in the departments of health policy and management at George Washington University and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. He received his PhD in health policy and management from Johns Hopkins, where he was a health policy research scholar and centennial scholar. And he received an MPH and MA from George Washington University and a BA with high honors from Swarthmore College. Trent Stechschulte is a healthcare attorney with over a decade of experience in legal and compliance practice. He currently serves as vice president and general counsel at I Am Boundless. Previously, Trent held the role of general counsel and compliance officer at Equitas Health. He earned his Juris Doctorate from Cleveland Marshall College of Law and served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Health. And Trent has presented at numerous conferences on topics such as creating compliance programs, effective mentorship, federally qualified health centers, and transgender healthcare. And last but not least, Heather Walter-McCabe is an associate professor with a joint appointment at Wayne State University Law School and Wayne State University School of Social Work. Her research is at the intersection of law, social work, and public health, and her research translates complex legal issues and research findings across multiple professions to make that information accessible for use by practitioners and advocates in improving population health. Most recently, she is leading research examining law and policy impacting LGBTQ health, equity, and well-being. Thank you all so much for taking the time out to be with us today. So I'm going to jump right in and start with a question for Heather and ask you to set the stage for our conversation. So what do we mean when we talk about health equity for LGBTQ plus communities? And what does the legal landscape look like right now at a high level, especially with respect to access to gender affirming care?
Mute. Yes. Thanks, Maya. I'm going to share a few slides because I think it'll be helpful in setting the stage for what we're looking to do today. And I'm going to provide a context for where we are right now and what the political climate is for LGBTQ communities, but particularly trans communities. And thinking about why those things matter in terms of health equity. I also want to spend just a minute to talk about who are we talking about. We are talking about a wide variety of communities with different sexual orientations and gender identities. And it's important to remember when we say trans, for example, there are trans men and trans women, but there are also non-binary, gender fluid folks. And just keeping in mind that all of these communities that we're going to talk about today are really varied, and it's really important that when you're working with any individual that you find out where they're coming from and how they identify and are respectful of that. And keeping in mind that sexual orientation or sexuality and gender identity are two separate things. And that people of any gender identity can be any sexuality. And while a lot of people know that already, it's important to remind folks maybe who don't know as much about that, just so that as we get started with the conversation, we're all kind of on the same page. So slides here. The other thing that I like to do when we first start talking about issues of health equity is being really clear about what we're talking about. Being LGBTQ in any of these communities is not the risk factor itself. It's the social structures of bias and phobias that cause the inequities that are the risk factor. And it's really important to focus on those because those are the things that we can change. And it also takes some of the responsibility off the people who are being impacted to be resilient, which these communities are in many, many ways. But it puts the responsibility on the structures for changing in a way that is less full of bias and stigma and discrimination. And what are we talking about? So when, I think many of us on this call have been talking about these types of issues for many years. And as recently as 2022, I was showing the top news piece as the oh my gosh, we are at 240 anti-LGBTQ bills targeting, most of them targeting trans folks. And this is wildly out of proportion to what we've seen in the past. And then note that for this year, in 2023, the latest number that I was able to find is 504. So 240 was shocking when it happened. We are now at 501 this year. And so I kind of want to lay the stage for what we're seeing in terms of particularly states, although our speakers were going to talk about different levels of this, but particularly at the state level, a real increase in the number of anti-LGBTQ, again, particularly anti-trans bills being filed. The kinds of bills we're seeing lots of restrictions on gender affirming care for trans youth. And some of these states are even requiring that youth who are currently receiving gender affirming care have that care removed. Some of them giving a deadline. For example, my home state of Indiana, the deadline is December 31st for that in the bill that passed. looking at whether or not insurance coverage is going to be covering these things generally. And I think Trent is going to talk pretty specifically about Section 1557. Generally, we cannot discriminate in our insurance coverage, and part of that would be covering gender affirming care. And we're seeing challenges to that in court, and we're seeing challenges to that at the state level in terms of what they're doing. We're seeing youth participation in athletic bands. We're seeing states making laws about whether or not the school should honor the appropriate name and pronoun for a child with or without parental permission. Conversations and bills going forth about whether or not we can discuss any LGBTQ related anything in school, and leaving teachers reporting that they are wondering what they can and cannot talk about, particularly if a student brings it up and it's important to the student. Restrictions on IDs that confirm the correct gender for folks. We've seen Texas working to classify gender affirming care as child abuse. And we recently are seeing increasing attempts at restricting gender affirming care to adults. So while initially it was very targeted towards youth, we're seeing some states step into restrictions on gender affirming care for adults. And we're also going to be talking about other areas of law like employment law and as I mentioned before, Section 1557 as we go through. So these are just some of the areas that we're starting to see a real increase in activity at the state level in ways that can impact the health of LGBTQ and particularly trans and non-binary communities. The ACLU provided this map that shows how many bills are coming about in each state this year. And as you can see, many states have had 10 or more bills introduced that are anti-LGBTQ. This is another graphic showing the incredible increase. I really don't like the word exponential. A lot of times I think it's overused, but if we look at this chart from 2022 to 2023, I think exponential may be the right word here. And it's in various different areas, but this is again what we're seeing, particularly in anti-trans non-binary legislation. Why does this matter? So we talked at the beginning about the risk factor being the stigma and the bias rather than the risk factor being that someone is a member of the LGBTQ community. And Elon Meyer posited minority stress theory, which really looks at the ways that prejudice and stigma that are directed at LGBTQ folks can bring about stressors that cause adverse health outcomes. And they can be physical and or mental health issues. And it's really important to think about what are the ways that we who work in policy and law think about how policy is a part of that that system, and how can we think about policy as a way to either minimize these stressors or exacerbate them. And how do we talk about that with lawmakers? How do we talk about that with other health equity folks? How are we really thinking about policy and the impact it's having on folks on the ground, particularly for the purposes of this presentation, their health? Kinds of health inequities we see for populations under this umbrella are disparities in socioeconomic status, much of which centers around employment discrimination, housing access and housing discrimination. Risk for violence is a disparate, so both death or homicide, physical and sexual assault and abuse. You hear a lot about this lately as we're talking about gender affirming care and the medical necessity of it for folks who are experiencing gender dysphoria. And we're seeing a real disparate risk in suicide attempts. LGBT populations generally see this risk at 2 to 3 times that of the general population, with bisexual communities actually being a little bit higher than their lesbian and gay cohorts or folks. And for transgender populations, defined broadly, we're seeing 9 times the rate of the general population. And this is a real concern when we're talking about removing care, medically necessary care, from folks who then experience this kind of impact of not getting what they need. We also see low rates of access to healthcare coverage, and access meaning insurance coverage, which Trent will talk about later, and even culturally competent care. So if they can get there, is the care they're getting appropriate? We see disparate rates of HIV and other STIs, and disparate rates of substance and alcohol use disorders. And why am I talking about this? I want to kind of give a sense of what's happening right now. For the first time, Equality for Florida actually issued a travel advisory for Florida for folks in LGBTQ communities, given some of the laws and policies that are happening there. Erin Reed, who puts together Erin in the Morning, which is she does a Substack looking at many of the court cases and things as they come out. She has put together, after receiving multiple requests from families of where they could go with their child, where was safe to travel, she compiled 2 maps. And she calls them the travel risk and safe living conditions, the legislative risk assessment. And as you can see here, we have 1 do not travel state per her map. And again, these are maps that she has designed. And if you would like to see the way that she put them together and her methods, they are actually at the link that is on the slide. And these slides will be available to you following the session. But this slide is for adults and this slide for youth. And a lot of what she's hearing is from parents who are trying to figure out where they can go, that it will be safe to get their child the care that they need. There are some states that are doing some really supportive things. And an example of that is a Minnesota executive order from March of this year, which required their state agencies to work to ensure that health plans in the state cover gender affirming care. They also, in this order, said that no state agencies are going to provide assistance to states that are attempting to get information about gender affirming care from someone who has come to their state to get that care. And they also put in this executive order that they would refuse to extradite a person from Minnesota to another state if they're seeking to be extradited on the basis of seeking gender affirming care. Other states have done this now. And so while we're seeing some difficult things, it's important to note where good things are happening and pay attention to that as well. At the same time, all of this is happening, I'm watching my time here, we're seeing lots of court action. I've put some examples of court challenges that are happening right now in terms of gender affirming care bans, trans athletes, and bathroom bill challenges and ID bill challenges. And this is simply a small sampling of them. Most of the ones you'll see here are actually still in process. Again, just to give you a sense of how much activity is happening on a daily basis. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has also weighed in on some of these cases, saying that the federal government is actually weighing in regarding specifically some of these gender affirming care bans. And our speakers will be speaking a little bit more about these later, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's happening with that. So as we move forward and you get more on the ground information from our next 2 panelists, I just want you to have the frame in mind of how things are changing and the potential real impact for health on the ground for folks. This map put together by the MAP project, Movement Advancement Project, shows, they call it their gender identity tally. And they again, if you want to see their methods, please go and check them out. And they have all kinds of amazing maps for almost every topic that I've mentioned today. I can't recommend them strongly enough in terms of being able to get data on a specific state's laws. But this is a change from 2010 to 2020 to what we're seeing in 2023. While a few states have had some improvements, we're certainly seeing some backsliding. And so keeping this in mind as we're thinking about health and what we need to do moving forward. And my last slide before I turn it over to my colleagues is I like to show this. We talk about lots of different difficult things when we're talking about health equity here. And I want to remind folks of the amazing and vibrant and I can't even come up with all the words, communities that are under the umbrella. And this is just a few folks. I mean, I'll point out Admiral Levine, the one of the top public health directors, or the associate director in the country. And we've got stars and we've got activists. And so it is not all dismal, but we are at a point where we need to discuss it and think about what it is we can do to try to keep some of the disparate impact that we currently are seeing from continuing. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn that back to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for laying out that background for us, Heather. As you've highlighted, there's so many complicated legal issues going on. I'd like to focus our conversation on two broad areas of concern. One is, as you mentioned, getting health insurance coverage for gender affirming care. And the second is, of course, the outright criminalization of this healthcare. So let's start with the insurance coverage issue. And so I'll turn it to Trent for this question. So Trent, can you give us a deeper dive into the availability of health insurance coverage for gender affirming care in particular? What are insurance companies and employers required to cover in their plans? And what are some of the legal and the operational challenges to getting that coverage?
Thank you so much. And yeah, as Heather highlighted, there's millions of transgender, kids and adults that face tons of barriers when accessing health insurance and healthcare in general. As early as 2014, many transgender people were denied coverage altogether because there was transgender exclusions on the books. So many of these exclusions were actually on the books since the early 80s, when Medicare began excluding gender affirming surgeries. So these exclusions forced transgender people to forgo necessary treatments, to pay out of pocket for medically necessary services, all of which Kellan will be talking about here in the next 15 minutes. One big step, as Heather noted, was in 2016 with the final rule of Section 1557, which was a provision of the Affordable Care Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, age, and disability in regards to certain healthcare programs. So one of its major implications was its protection against discrimination based on gender identity. So this meant that trans folks, that healthcare providers and insurance companies receiving federal funds were prohibited from denying access to these services and access to insurance. So while Section 1557 goes into many different areas, the kind of actions we're talking about broadly from the 2016 rule was that healthcare providers could not refuse care based on someone's gender identity. Healthcare providers could not force individuals to have intrusive or unnecessary examination. Providers were required to treat patients in alignment with their gender identity, even when it comes to using bathrooms that align with their identity. And then it actually had a strict prohibition against conversion therapy. So it provides a robust framework, and it looks a lot like Title IX in education and Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination, and it seeks to apply those principles to health insurance. So it's the three different versions, right? We have healthcare, we have employment protections, we have education protections. But the original intent of Section 1557 has been challenged since it's been passed, essentially. And it's had a very uneasy relationship, I will say, with the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, so RFRA, as we'll refer to it as we go on. The act is meant to serve to protect religious freedom, but its application has come at odds a lot with gender identity protections outlined in a lot of different statutes, but specifically on Section 1557. So quickly, just to give some context around RFRA, is this was signed by Bill Clinton in 1993, and it was in reaction to a case in Oregon where they refused to give unemployment benefits to Native Americans that were fired for using peyote as part of a religious ceremony. Our government felt that Supreme Court case set a dangerous precedent. And so we were going to pass a law that said governments cannot pass laws that were neutral, that maybe impacted religious freedoms. I know that's oversimplifying the rule a lot, but I kind of want to keep moving here. So over the years, RFRA has been applied in many different contexts, but I think when it comes to LGBTQIA plus rights, one of the more notable cases as a flashpoint for the LGBTQIA plus community was the Hobby Lobby store's Supreme Court case. There, Hobby Lobby argued that the Affordable Care Act's requirement that they provide health insurance coverage for contraception went against their religious beliefs. The Supreme Court, in a pretty narrow decision, said yes to Hobby Lobby. You can say refuse contraceptive coverage based on your religious objections under RFRA. So given that Hobby Lobby precedent and the broad language of RFRA, there were some immediate concerns that individuals and businesses could claim religious exemptions to laws that protect trans folks, right? For instance, a healthcare provider might say certain treatments and procedures for transgender individuals is against their religious beliefs, so they're not covering them. An employer may say, I can discriminate you based on my religious beliefs that LGBTQIA plus folks don't deserve the same harassment protections. And what about employer-sponsored health plans? Can we treat trans folks based on sexual orientation differently? So in June, there's a little sigh of relief in Bostock when the Supreme Court said that gender identity was a form of sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So it protects individuals from workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The case here included a county employee fired for his involvement in a gay softball league, and a funeral home worker fired for her decision to undergo gender affirming care. So after the Bostock, employers now were required to ensure that they were not denying opportunities based on gender identity or treating transgender employees differently, from firing to harassment, even to unintentional but consistent misnaming and misgendering of trans staff. But the Bostock decision, while it meant many workplaces are going to be more inclusive, there was a lot of nuances, and there have been a lot of court cases that have been filling the gaps with those nuances. And we're seeing that play out. So one of the cases working through the circuit courts is now squarely asking whether religious-leaning employers or religious organizations, so whether religious-leaning employers or religious organizations are exempt from Title VII protections because of the RFRA, right? Because of the Religious Freedom of Restorations Act. And now there's a disagreement between this circuit courts, some holding that it does not exempt religious institutions from claims of discrimination. Other circuits have held that the exemption is too broad, and religious schools, religious organizations are entirely exempt from Title VII. And there's even one case that says religious organizations and religious leaning organizations are exempt. While that wasn't accepted by the circuit court, there are district courts playing that out. So in addition to this, other post-Bostock developments includes challenges to school bathroom policies and the recognition of discriminatory practices in employer health plans, right? So this all comes back around where you're seeing these employer protections being eroded with RFRA, and now they're turning to Section 1557 as well. So just recently, the Fifth Circuit said that medical providers cannot be mandated to perform gender transition procedures or abortions if these actions conflict with their religious beliefs. And that was from a 2021 lawsuit filed by the Catholic Hospital Association against the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And their argument was that the federal mandate to offer gender affirming care and abortions was in direct violation of their religious rights. And then you have the Fourth Circuit, which is reviewing cases from North Carolina and West Virginia concerning state-covered health care for transgender individuals. So these cases address coverage in North Carolina State Employee Health Plan, while also covering gender-affirming surgery in West Virginia. The counsel for North Carolina saying that gender-affirming care is never appropriately to be covered because it's not an illness. So these cases, and I know Kellan will talk a little bit about this, they fit neatly in the analysis we're talking about, and we kind of see where this is going. To Heather's point, these court rulings aren't carte blanche. They're not ruling that health providers can deny coverage for trans individuals. The courts are not universally granting hospitals the right to deny care to trans individuals, but rather they're opposing a lot of the gender affirming care that's really necessary for the treatment and care of transgender individuals. And then since all of this is going on, we do know that the Biden administration proposed additions to the equal access rule when it comes to Section 1557. Those are still in the comment period, but that really addresses a healthcare provider's personal beliefs, and those personal beliefs cannot act as a barrier to essential healthcare services necessary. Local statutes cannot act as a barrier to essential healthcare services. So you cannot get around Section 1557 through RFRA or other local rules. So also, as you know, Kellan's going to go in this just a bit, but I do want to talk just a little bit about the state of Medicare and commercial health plans. First, it's crucial to note that Medicare does cover routine preventative care for everyone, regardless of gender markers. But one thing we're finding health systems, struggle with a little bit is that there's a lot of denial for claims between services because of gender mismatch or gender marker issues. So there was a significant milestone, we know, in 2014, where affirmation surgery was considered experimental, but healthcare companies and insurers are still struggling with those gender mismatch and is creating a lot of pain points for trans individuals. So regarding commercial insurance, we talked a little bit about how the Affordable Care Act maintains health plans must cover essential health benefits, and these cover 10 categories. But how does that fit in with transgender health is that the Department of Health and Human Services, through its regulations, really has allowed states to define what those essential health benefits are. And so for trans individuals, this means that they may be entitled to certain services under their Medicaid program in one state versus another. So while the ACA did in Section 57 has broadened the scope, it still is becoming a state-by-state issue that we're working through. And last, as we're working through counseling health systems and healthcare clients, it is important to have an inclusive work environment. So by having non-discrimination policies, that's one step. There's a lot of resources out there, like the Transgender Law Center's website. Having written policies that are addressing a lot of the things up here is important as well. Regarding healthcare, I think as leaders and as advocates within our organization, it's essential to advocate for plans to cover affirmation surgery and hormone replacement therapies, of which Kellan's going to talk about. And also the last I want to talk with, because there are some operational issues with gender mismatches, is working with your healthcare operations staff to understand the barriers created by your EMR, your intake, and even your front desk policies around registering trans folks to make sure their experience is good. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Trent. So much going on with challenges around access to health insurance coverage. And of course, another issue that's been getting a lot of media attention is outright criminalization of gender affirming care. So before we get to Kellan on that issue, just want to remind our audience, if you have questions as you're hearing our speakers, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box. But I'm going to turn it to Kellan now. As Heather mentioned, we've been seeing sort of a growing state-by-state movement to ban gender affirming care. So Kellan, can you tell us more about gender affirming care and about the experience of healthcare providers on the ground who are seeking to follow best practices and professional standards of care for their patients in this policy environment that we have right now?
Sure. Thank you, Maya. It's great to be here with everyone today. There's a real movement across the country, as you've heard from Heather and Trent, to ban best practice care for transgender people. And that's really driven by disinformation. That is, things that people know are wrong and that they are spreading intentionally in order to take advantage of the relative unfamiliarity that a lot of people have with transgender people, transgender identities, and gender affirming care. When you're talking about gender affirming care, it's really important to think through and listen to the ways that it is being described. Gender affirming care is nothing new. It has been around for many, many decades, and it is described in expert standards of care that are routinely used by clinicians across the US and across the world to ensure that transgender people can live safely and authentically as who they truly are. So the best way to think about gender affirming care is that it is individualized and age-appropriate care that's provided to transgender people for several reasons. The sort of central one from a medical perspective is to treat gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is recognized as a serious medical condition by every major US medical association, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, Psychiatric Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the World Health Organization. In the US, as around the world, gender affirming care is provided by licensed medical professionals according to these expert standards of care. In fact, the first standard of care in transgender health was compiled in 1979 and has been continuously updated ever since. It's now in its 8th edition. The process of gender affirming care is really not one size fits all, which is one of the reasons why these bans are so problematic, because they apply a sort of single binary yes, no, permitted, prohibited, really rigid and lack of nuance in terms of the decisions that doctors have to make, that parents have to make, that patients, whatever their age, have to make as far as what they need in order to be fully and authentically themselves. All gender affirmation for transgender people at any age takes place in close consultation with providers. And I think one of the big sort of pieces of disinformation that is out there about gender affirming care is a focus on children. The idea that there is some form of gender affirming care that children are being subjected to when they are too young to know anything about who they are or how they want to grow up. It's important to know the earliest intervention, and it's not really an intervention for children with gender dysphoria, is nothing but listening to a young person when they tell you who they are, what kind of hairstyle or clothing they want to wear. Social transition is recommended by pediatricians. It is supported by expert medical providers from a variety of professions, and it's fully reversible. Again, it's just listening to a young person when they tell you how they want to dress, how they want to wear their hair, maybe if they have a name or pronoun that's different from what they've been using before. For adolescents, the standard of care for decades has been puberty delay medications that give young people the opportunity to think through their needs without the pressure of the irreversible changes that puberty brings along. These reversible medications, again, have been studied for many, many years, and they are used routinely for both transgender and cisgender young people in order to make sure they go through the right puberty at the right time. There's a robust body of evidence behind these interventions. The most recent version of the standards of care involved hundreds of professionals in transgender health from across the world. And the evidence shows that interventions to treat gender dysphoria at various ages, again, individualized and age appropriate, these interventions are linked to many positive health outcomes, including better quality of life, lower rates of mental health conditions, all of the minority stress exposures and outcomes that Heather was describing, lower rates of depression, anxiety, psychological distress, decreases in gender dysphoria, and fewer encounters with discrimination. When trans young people have access to the care that they need in order to be who they truly are, they're able to thrive and to have happy and healthy childhoods that set them up for success later in life. By contrast, what we're seeing now, the weaponization of the law to allow politicians to harass and threaten young people, their parents, and their doctors. And this causes real tangible harms. There's a body of evidence out there looking, for example, at what happened to mental health among lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in states that passed constitutional bans on marriage equality about 20 years ago. Being treated like a political football in politics and in the press and in public life more generally is harmful. It hurts people and it has lasting effects, particularly for young people. These bans are also an economic and racial justice consideration. You may have been hearing about people leaving states that have bans in order to make sure that their kids can access the affirming care that they need. And think about who is left behind. In order to be able to leave these states, you have to have access to a certain level of resources. You have to be able to scrape together the money for a rent somewhere else. You have to be able to find a job somewhere else. And when you're talking about the families that have those kinds of choices versus those that don't, again, it is an economic and a racial justice issue in this country. We know that providing young people or trans people at any age with gender-affirming care improves mental health outcomes, improves a wide variety of psychosocial outcomes. We also know that denying care is extremely harmful because we're essentially telling young people that they cannot have access to the doctor-prescribed medical healthcare, medical care that they need in order to live as who they really are. So in sort of summing up, because I think we want to get to the questions and conversation, it's very important when we are thinking about these bans on gender-affirming care that we really understand what is at stake here. This isn't just a matter of law, and it isn't a matter of unanswered questions or legitimate confusion in the medical field. There is no controversy in the medical field. There are decades of data that show the safety and efficacy of this medically necessary care for transgender people. It is clear, too, that there will never be enough data to satisfy those people who fundamentally oppose this care, fundamentally oppose the existence of transgender people for political or religious reasons. There's really very few other areas of medical care that are subject to scrutiny like this. And it is entirely, I'm just going to say it, it is entirely manufactured for political purposes. Just because this information is new to some people does not mean that the science is new or that there are unanswered questions. The research, the experience are decades long. The care is well established. Here at Whitman-Walker, we provide care to thousands of transgender people. We know very well what it looks like to support the health and well-being of transgender people, and these laws are anything but. So Maya, I will turn it back over to you for what I hope will be a robust discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kellan, and thank you, Heather and Trent as well. We've got a few questions in the Q&A, and people can continue to post. I just want to kick off with one question. Heather, you talked about, what a diverse community the LGBTQ plus community is, and Kellan just raised that this is the economic and racial justice issues as well. Heather, did you want to say more about what data we have on which groups of people are sort of most impacted by some of the legal issues that we've been discussing?
Sure. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this. I want to recognize, again, I come today as a white, cis, queer woman. And so I want to make sure that it's clear when I'm talking regarding trans communities, that it's very important to ensure that if we're doing policy, if we're looking at care standards, things like that, that we are inclusive of people from communities and that they're not just rubber stamping at the end, but they're actually at the table helping to set the agenda and maybe even designing the size and shape of the table themselves. And so I just want to kind of from a space of positionality, name that. Additionally, one of the things that I did not say strongly or at all, even in the health inequities, is really looking at the issue of intersectionality. And when you add particularly race, any other group, but particularly race, to any of the impacted LGBTQ community members, we see disparities at an even more disparate rate. And if we don't address that and we don't think about that, we are not doing ourselves any favors. Additionally, as we talk about the violence component, I think that it would be remiss to not mention the level of violence that is seen against particularly Black trans women, and in a way that we really need to be thinking about that as we're thinking about laws and policies, as we're thinking about what kinds of supports we're giving people, as we're thinking about what's happening when we are creating based on misinformation. Kellan, thank you for being so very clear about that. Policies based on misinformation and what the ultimate impact is of that kind of thing long term. And so I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to say that. And I would welcome Kellan and Trent if you have anything that you want to add. I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that, and that it's clear that we need to be sure that we're facing that head on as we look at these policies, as we're looking at all of it, access to care.
Thank you, Heather. If Kellan and Trent, you don't want to jump in, I can move on to a couple of good questions we have in the Q&A. So one question here is about the justification of many insurance programs to not cover gender affirming care has been because it is not, quote, medically necessary. And are there efforts to establish a federal standard of medical necessity? Or maybe we can explain a little bit more about how standards of medical necessity are developed or implemented on the ground in practice. Kellan, can I throw that one to you to start? And then maybe Trent can jump in and from the insurance perspective as well.
Sure, there is no federal standard for medical necessity. The closest thing is probably in the Medicare statute, which reasonable and necessary to treat a medical condition or to restore function of a body part. And the reason that there isn't any more detailed definition of medical necessity really anywhere in the law is because it is really, like gender affirming care, individualized for people. What is medically necessary for one person may not be medically necessary for another. And it's really up to clinicians working with their patients and according to expert standards of care in the field to determine what is medically necessary for the treatment of any particular condition. And so that's, again, why we are so concerned about these bans, because they really take away that decision-making ability by the people who are best positioned to make that determination. It's already problematic enough that so often determinations of medical necessity sit within sort of black box procedures or black box processes within insurance companies when they're, you get a denial and then you have to go through different levels of medical review. Where maybe you're moving farther and farther away from the conversation between the provider and their patient. But it's even worse when you think about putting this decision in the hands of politicians, because there's simply no way to know a priori what is or is not medically necessary for any given person. It really relies on the medical judgment, the examination, the conversation, and the relevant standards of care in the field.
Trent, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, that was a perfect answer. And I think too, is a lot of the case law that's going through in section 1557 is really, to Kellan's, it's really oversimplifying how complex each individual patient, their experience is with their doctor, and how they're trying to put all of these into a box when that's not how healthcare works.
Thank you both. So another question is, are there any legal protections for children who are being denied this care by their parents? So if a parent does not want their child to have gender affirming care, can a child get that care? I mean, this is a tricky one, because we also know that one of the arguments that have been made in challenges to bans on gender affirming care is that parents have a constitutional right to control of their children's upbringing and to make medical decisions around their children. So I think that's a tough one to tackle. So does someone want to jump in on answering that question? Can children access this care, and adolescent access this care if their parents do not want them to access this care? And sort of how do we grapple with the parent's role in this situation?
And I think a lot of it has to do with state law protections, and there's a lot of state law exemptions. What requires parental approval? So certain state law, and I have not researched this issue. So there may be certain states that allow for an exception to consent for this, but I'm assuming there's very few. Kellan, do you have any experience, particularly in the states like Virginia, Maryland area around that?
They're really, it's to your point, it's a fraught area because when we are talking about minors, we are talking about their ability, their capacity to give assent and their parents' responsibility to consent to the care that is provided. There are very rare exceptions where young people have been emancipated from their parents and sought care, and I'm not talking specifically about the area of gender affirming care, but just broadly speaking. But in general, I think, what we're really encountering so often in this conversation is supportive parents. It's very important to be aware of sort of the full spectrum of the experiences that trans young people are having. But by and large, what we're talking about here is parents who are supportive, kids who want to give their assent, parents who consent under the care of a clinician and are being told by a politician who has no knowledge of the situation whatsoever that they're going to overrule the parent. So it would be a very rare instance where someone is emancipated legally from their parents to consent to any type of care. And so I think really the focus of the conversation has been on the degree to which so many parents support their kids and are being told by clinicians that they can't, being told by politicians that they can't.
Thank you for that. Howard, did you want to jump in?
Well, and I thought while we're on that topic, I think there was a question in the chat about whether or not, as a school social worker, that they would be required in states where they have in some states where a child discloses their gender identity or sexual orientation, would they be required to report that to the parents? That also is very state specific and very law specific. Certainly in Texas, it's going through the courts still and is not applicable to some people, but it is to others. That not only would you have to report to the parents, but there is a law that says that should be reported to CPS. And I think that the NASW chapter in Texas is really looking at this and trying to take this on, as well as their court cases going on. But in other states, it's very state dependent. There are some states that have laws that say if a child asks to be called a different pronoun or asks to be called any name that is not listed on their school record, that the parent has to be contacted unless they already have written permission from the parent. As a non-school employee, I'm not sure how that works. It probably would depend on the kind of contract that you have with the school to do your work within the school. And so I would just say that you likely would have to look at that, although I certainly would welcome input from Kellan and Trent if they view it differently, but that would be my thought on a non-employee. And some states that's not the case. Some states actually have policy supporting using the pronoun and name that is appropriate for the child and that they're requesting to be called.
Thank you. Well, it looks to me like we only have a minute left. There is a question about if the panelists have a sort of a go-to relatively brief primer for people who want to understand gender affirming care for minors in particular, and something we can share to help educate people and friends and colleagues. So we will put that together, and we can add that to the slides that we can share after the fact. But before we wrap up, do the panelists have any final thoughts before we close, either from Kellan or Trent?
Yeah, to your point about, or the question about a relatively brief primer, the Board of Children, Youth, and Families at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has just released a brief that covers the proceedings of a workshop that was held earlier this year with providers, parents, kids, researchers, lawyers, kind of the whole gamut of folks who think a lot about medical care and support for transgender people, or transgender young people in particular. So we can share the link to that. It includes a very helpful recap of the recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as a discussion of some of the myths and realities around care for transgender young people. And it includes some pointers. I see another question here about the medical literature. It includes some pointers in that direction. It's really kind of in some ways unprecedented situation where we are seeing the ability of providers to recommend a course of care that is supported by the evidence that is outlined in standards of care, and having politics stand in the way. And I really just want to end on the note that it's important to think about this challenging environment for transgender people and their families in the context of broader attacks on bodily autonomy. This is absolutely related to abortion and reproductive health. It's absolutely related to the types of decisions that people get to make about their bodies, about their own personal medical needs. And so this isn't just, it never was just about transgender people. It's about the more fundamental question of who gets to make personal and private decisions about what happens to our bodies. And so I think it's very important to see these laws banning best practice care in this broader perspective.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Asha Scelzo and Tori Nadal and to our AV team for helping this run so smoothly. And thank you to our audience, for all of you for attending. We hope you'll continue to participate in our upcoming events in the Health Law and Policy Program's Future of Healthcare series. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation, and I learned so much from our panelists. Really appreciate it.